welcome everyone. Today I'm very excited to have Kendra Lynn with us from the Hawaiian Volcano Observatory to chat with her about the 2022 Mauna Loa eruption. And before diving into the actual work that you did, can you maybe quickly or briefly run us through the Mauna Loa eruption? What happened and how does this eruption compare to previous or more historic eruptions at Mauna Loa?
So the Mauna Loa 22 eruption was preceded by several months of fairly intense volcanic unrest. So the Hawaiian Volcano Observatory and our staff were closely monitoring major increases in the frequency and magnitude of earthquakes at Mauna Loa, as well as several of changes in several of our other instrumental monitoring data streams. And so, as early as October, we knew that something was changing at Mauna Loa, and we hadn't seen unrest at these levels in many, many years. And certainly, the volcano was rather long overdue for an eruption. Its last eruption occurred in 1984. And there were several periods of unrest between 1984 and 2022. But in the fall of 22, the changes in the monitoring data suggested that we might be nearing the next eruption. And so the elevated seismicity and other instrumental monitoring data really ramped up again in the late hours Hawaii Standard Time on the evening of 27 November 2022. At around 11:30 local time, the Mauna Loa eruption began in the summit caldera, which is called Mokua Ve'oveo. Those fissures cut across the summit caldera over a matter of minutes to hours. And by dawn, several hours later, the summit fissures were waning. So activity was ceasing in the summit caldera, and instead the eruption had propagated down the northeast rift zone, where more fissures opened up at high elevations on the volcano's flanks. So this is over 11,000 feet above sea level, or over 3,000 meters, I believe. And those fissures were active for several hours to days. Most of them ended after several days, and only one fissure remained that fed the eruption for about 2 weeks. So the eruption duration was approximately 13 days.
Okay, thank you. And so you now already talked about unrest activity and eruption run-up. Did you have such high unrest activity already in the past, like in the past 2 or 3 decades, where you had these unrest activity events? And what was different this time, or why is it generally so difficult to distinguish between unrest and eruption run-up?
In the past several decades, there have certainly been time periods where Mauna Loa exhibited elevated levels of unrest. This would include increased rates and sometimes magnitudes of earthquakes and seismicity at the volcano, but also changes in what we call inflation rate. So when magma rises up into a volcano, we often see changes in ground elevation, and they're very subtle, but we can measure them quite precisely. And so when magma enters a volcano, you can imagine it sort of like when you fill your lungs with air and your chest expands and rises a little bit. Sort of the same analogy might apply in this case, where magma enters the volcano and it causes the ground surface to rise just a little bit. And so we call this inflation, and it usually is interpreted as magma rising up inside the volcano. And so these two things, inflation as well as increased seismicity, were seen over a couple of different time periods, each lasting months to years, in the early 2000s and around 2015 or so. And so this was not uncommon at Mauna Loa. Neither of the previous major episodes of unrest led to an eruption. And thus, in 2021, when we first saw earthquake swarms, and then again in earnest in 2022, we had this question of whether or not this would be another round of volcanic unrest, or whether or not this particular series of events would lead to an eventual eruption. And that issue, distinguishing between unrest that ultimately wanes again, and the volcano might be quieter after that, versus events that do lead to volcanic eruptions, is often very challenging, even in some of the best studied volcanic systems in the world. And so at the time, in October of 22, I mentioned increases in seismicity and other monitoring data sets. We knew that the potential for an eruption was significantly higher than it had been in the months preceding that time. And it's still our ultimate goal, and yet our biggest challenge, to be able to fingerprint exactly when an eruption might start. That remains enigmatic for most volcanoes around the world.
Okay, and so let's now talk a little bit more about your study and what you did. Can you talk us through the data sets that you are using in your work to retrospectively distinguish the eruption runup from the very long unrest period?
Yeah, so it might help to explain that my scientific specialty is that I'm a petrologist. So I study the composition of erupted lavas and their minerals to better understand the history of those magmas prior to eruption. And so those are the kinds of things that I try to do when I study volcanoes. And so as a petrologist, of course, you can only study magma after it has erupted, right? So it is inherently a retrospective tool. But the exciting part about this study is that by looking at recently erupted samples and then looking back at the monitoring data, we can make stronger interpretations about what instrumental data might be recording in real time prior to an eruption. For example, at most volcanoes around the world, it's very common to see changes in instrumental monitoring data and say, okay, magma is moving through this system. Magma is becoming shallower. Magma is rising or moving down a rift zone, right? So you can make sort of general statements about the magmatic processes happening beneath your feet. And one of the exciting aspects of linking those data with the erupted samples is that in our case, we can then look back and refine those statements with more precision. So in the case of the Mauna Loa 22 eruption, the erupted minerals actually act as tiny little stopwatches. So they record time, and by interrogating their chemistries and doing a little bit of mathematical modeling, we can say with some certainty how long a crystal sat at high temperature inside a volcano in a certain place before it erupted. We call this technique diffusion chronometry. And when we looked at the Mauna Loa 22 crystals, they were pretty much all recording timescales that lined up with the major changes we observed in late September and early October of 2022 in the seismicity, the deformation, as well as many of our other monitoring data signals. And so what this allowed us to do, and what I get really excited about, is that instead of saying, okay, we know magma is moving, we can now say with some certainty, magma moved from here to here at this time, right? So you can give it some more constraints, both in time and in space. And in this particular eruption, what was remarkable and noteworthy was that we think we're able to show for the first time intrusion of magma into the shallowest portions of the volcano's plumbing system. This had never been recorded before, partly because the instrumental monitoring network wasn't around in its current capacity in 1984. There have been a lot of technological advances in how we monitor these volcanoes. And so the last time there was an eruption, we didn't have many of the data streams that we have now. And so being able to use the eruptive samples to make this connection allows us to look back at older eruptions and their samples and think about how quickly magmas might be moving prior to many Mauna Loa eruptions, not just the 2022 eruption.
Yeah, that's really exciting. And will these results help you to improve so when we are forward looking into the future, will this help you to improve the monitoring at Mauna Loa, or is it very challenging to implement this for continuous monitoring? And also, can these findings be employed for other volcanoes worldwide?
especially for Mauna Loa, this technique becomes stronger every time you're able to use it. So the more eruptions we have where we can make these kinds of comparisons, the better we can look for patterns in both the monitoring data and the mineral chemistry. And established patterns often help you to think about potential forecasts or probabilities of unrest leading to an eruption. And so my ultimate goal is that this technique will help us to understand future events at Mauna Loa. Specifically, being able to link the minerals and the movement of magma into the shallowest portion of the reservoir was really critically reliant on the interpretation of shallow tilt signals. So tilt is another type of monitoring data where if the ground is inflating, a tilt meter is moving with respect to how that ground is moving in space. And so the MOK tilt meter, which sits right on the very summit of Mauna Loa, recorded an inflation signal for the first time since its installation. And so in future eruptions, we might look to that tilt meter to be the signal that magma is actually accumulating quite shallowly underneath the summit. And at least for the 22 eruption, those were the conditions that really triggered the eruption in November of 22. So those are the kinds of things we would look for in future Mauna Loa instrumental monitoring, as well as the changes in the other data sets that we noted in our work. Globally, what's really interesting is that certainly we're not the first to try to compare mineral chronometry with instrumental data. In fact, this is only the 5th study of its kind with this sort of detailed comparison. And globally, most volcanic systems have never had a diffusion chronometry study applied. Most systems that have had an eruption since 1500 have no diffusion studies. And so in very active volcanic systems, I think it could be a very powerful tool globally. And even in those systems that are not so active, as was the case with Mauna Loa, this was its first eruption in almost 40 years. This retrospective look and linking with the monitoring data is really, I think, going to help us understand future unrest at Mauna Loa. And so I would hope to see similar types of comparisons or studies done in other places globally, both for very active and infrequently active volcanic systems. The potential to unlock better understanding of all of our interdisciplinary data, I think, is really high. And it's exciting to think about the things we might learn elsewhere or how our insights from Mauna Loa could be applied at other systems globally.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for walking us through your work and through the implications this might have, not just for Mauna Loa, but for volcano monitoring worldwide. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for having me.